Marcus Bennett sat near the window in his classroom at Jefferson High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. He had always liked this spot. It gave him a sense of comfort, a little bit of privacy, and, most importantly, from here, he could see the schoolyard, where an old oak tree stood silently, its roots deeply embedded in the ground like a quiet witness to time. Every day, he sat in this exact place, his pencil tapping lightly against the edge of his notebook, a subconscious habit his mother constantly reminded him to stop. "Marcus, you need to stop that, or you'll tear the paper," she once said. But he couldn't. It helped him focus, helped his thoughts flow more smoothly. The classroom buzzed with activity as usual. Groups of students chatted, discussing last night's basketball game, the upcoming math test, or the newest movie in theaters. A group of girls in the corner giggled, sneaking glances at their phones under the desk. A few boys at the back animatedly talked about the school's sports team, their voices filled with excitement. But Marcus wasn't part of any of it. He was focused on his history assignment, trying to finish it before the teacher arrived. Marcus wasn't the type of student who stood out. He wasn't one of the funny ones, nor someone who sought attention. He was the quiet type, someone who preferred observing rather than speaking, thinking rather than debating. His classmates knew he was a good student, but none of them really knew much about him. Except for Tyler Whitman, the one friend Marcus truly trusted. His desk was always tidy. Books were stacked neatly, his pencil always placed in a straight line. Some might call it perfectionism, but for him, it was just a habit, a way to maintain order in a world where he had little control. He always completed his assignments ahead of time, not to impress teachers, but because he simply liked it that way. He didn't want to be called to the board or draw attention to himself. But no matter how much he tried to stay unnoticed, Marcus could never escape the gaze of Ms. Thornton. Ms. Abigail Thornton had been teaching history at Jefferson High for over 15 years. She was known for being strict but fair, at least in the eyes of the students she favored. But Marcus wasn't one of them. From the very first weeks of the school year, he had noticed something off about the way she treated him. She never scolded him, never openly insulted him, but at the same time, she had never really seen him. Every time Marcus raised his hand to answer a question, her eyes would skim past him as if he were invisible. If another student raised their hand, she would call on them, even encouraging them when they got the answer wrong. But if Marcus was wrong, she would pause just a little longer, as if savoring the moment. And if he was right? She would simply nod coldly and move on without a word of praise, without a single acknowledgement. Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed. One day, during lunch break, Tyler sat down next to him in the cafeteria, his expression thoughtful. "Have you noticed she barely ever looks at you?" Tyler asked, grabbing a fry from his tray and chewing it slowly. Marcus just shrugged, continuing to eat his sandwich. "I'm used to it." "No, but I mean," Tyler frowned. "Like, she never calls on you. But when you do answer, if you're wrong, she makes sure to drag it out. And if you're right, she just ignores it." Marcus nodded. "I know." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "And that doesn't bother you?" Marcus thought for a moment before sighing. "Of course, it does. But what can I do? If I say something, who's going to believe me?" Tyler was silent for a while, then shook his head. "Probably no one." Marcus wasn't the kind of person who liked causing trouble, and he didn't want to turn it into a big issue. He had dealt with it for the entire school year and had gotten used to being overlooked. But today, something was different. Miss Thornton was looking at him. Not the usual glance that passed over him like before. It wasn't annoyance, nor was it anger. It was something else. A kind of anticipation. Marcus felt uneasy. She had never paid attention to him before. So why now? He lowered his head, forcing himself to continue writing his assignment, but his mind was racing with confusion. And then, the bell rang, signaling the start of class. Students quickly pushed their chairs back into place, abandoned their unfinished conversations, and the atmosphere in the classroom shifted. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to push away the unease growing inside him. But in the back of his mind, one thought remained: today would not be like any other day. Marcus Bennett was used to silence. He didn't need praise, nor did he seek attention. But that morning, when Miss Thornton called his name, the classroom fell into a different kind of silence, a heavy, meaningful one. He blinked, convinced he had misheard. "Marcus," Miss Thornton's voice rang out again, sharp and leaving no room for doubt. "Why aren't you answering the question?" He looked up, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. Miss Thornton had never called his name before. He turned to the board. The question was written clearly in white chalk. What was the purpose of General Sherman's march to the sea? Marcus blinked. It was an easy question. He had read about it last night. He knew the answer. The march to the sea was a military campaign designed to destroy the Confederacy's resources, weaken their will to fight, and pressure them into surrendering. Miss Thornton slowly tilted her head. He couldn't read her expression, but he had the distinct feeling that she was evaluating him in a different way than before. She said, her voice devoid of emotion. Not bad. Not bad? Marcus thought. It was a completely correct answer. But instead of continuing with the lesson, Miss Thornton hesitated, as if considering something. Tyler, sitting beside him, shot him a questioning look. Other students in the class exchanged glances too, sensing something unusual about the situation. Then Miss Thornton said something Marcus never expected. "Stay after class for a moment." The entire class seemed to shift. A few students turned to look at him, their expressions curious. Marcus wasn't the kind of student who got held back after class. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't break rules. So why was today different? Marcus nodded slowly, but a bad feeling had already settled in his stomach. When the bell rang, students hurriedly packed up their books. Tyler hesitated, glancing at Marcus with concern. "You want me to wait for you?" Marcus shook his head. "It's fine. I'll be okay." Tyler nodded, but he still looked unsure as he left the classroom. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped toward the teacher's desk. Miss Thornton remained seated, her eyes scanning her lesson plans as if he were merely an afterthought. "Do you know why I asked you to stay, Marcus?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am." She set her papers down and, for the first time all year, looked at him directly. "I heard your grandfather was a musician." Marcus frowned. "Yes, that's right. He played the piano, didn't he?" He nodded, his heartbeat quickening slightly. Miss Thornton tilted her head, a faint smile appearing on her lips, but it wasn't warm. "I suppose that means you can play too?" Marcus felt his body tense. This wasn't just a casual question. This was a test. A little. Her smile widened. "Good. Then tomorrow, you'll perform for the class." Marcus blinked. "What?" Miss Thornton gestured toward the corner of the room, where an old, dust-covered piano sat forgotten. He had never seen anyone use it before. It must have been there for years. "Tomorrow, you will perform," she repeated, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. A trap. She wasn't asking him to play because she wanted to praise or support him. She was waiting for him to fail. He could see it in her eyes. She wanted him to stumble, to hesitate, to mess up. She wanted the class to laugh. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. He glanced at the piano, then back at Miss Thornton. "All right." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to agree so easily. "Good," she said, a trace of amusement in her voice. "I look forward to your performance." Marcus simply nodded, then picked up his backpack and walked out of the room. But as he stepped through the doorway, one thought settled firmly in his mind. Tomorrow would not be an ordinary day. Marcus Bennett barely slept that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his conversation with Miss Thornton over and over. She hadn't asked him to play the piano out of curiosity, nor to recognize his talent. She wanted him to fail. She expected a clumsy performance, trembling fingers on the keys, awkward pauses, and, most of all, the laughter of his classmates when he messed up. But she was wrong. Because she didn't know the truth. Marcus didn't just know how to play the piano. He had lived with music since he was a child. His grandfather, Raymond Bennett, had been a legendary jazz pianist in their local community. When Marcus was little, his grandfather had taught him every key, every chord, every intricate riff that a true jazz musician needed to master. Those long summer afternoons, with sunlight streaming through the living room window, his grandfather had sat beside him, patiently guiding his fingers over the keys. Playing the piano isn't just about hitting the right notes, Marcus, his grandfather used to say, his aged but steady hands gliding over the keyboard. You have to let the music flow through you. You have to feel it. And Marcus did feel it. He didn't play the piano as a hobby. He played it as a part of who he was. The next morning, as he stepped into the classroom, he felt the stares. The whispers. Does he actually know how to play? He's gonna mess up, for sure. Marcus didn't respond. He simply pulled out his chair and sat down, opening his notebook like it was any other day. But even as he forced himself to stay calm, his heartbeat was heavy in his chest. Miss Thornton entered the room, set her lesson plans down, and glanced at the clock. Good, we have a little time before we start today's lesson, she said in her usual monotone. Marcus, are you ready? The room fell into silence. Every single pair of eyes was on him. Marcus took a deep breath, shut his notebook, and stood up. He walked toward the old piano at the back of the classroom. As he approached, he noticed the thin layer of dust coating the keys, the yellowing ivory worn by time. He sat down, rested his hands on his lap, and exhaled slowly. Someone snickered. Another student whispered something he couldn't make out. But he didn't need to hear. He knew what they were thinking. Then, he placed his hands on the keys, feeling the cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. And he started to play. The first note rang out, soft but steady. Marcus had chosen a classic blues piece, one his grandfather had played for him hundreds of times. A song where every note carried a memory. The warm, rich sound filled the room, curling into every corner, settling into the spaces between their breath. The whispers stopped. Miss Thornton crossed her arms, her brows knitting together slightly. This wasn't what she had expected. Marcus kept going, his fingers gliding over the keys effortlessly. He didn't just play the melody, he breathed life into it. His left hand anchored the rhythm, while his right danced over the keys, weaving intricate improvisations. The classroom, once filled with judgment, was now wrapped in music. No one moved. Even the students who had laughed earlier were now sitting frozen in their seats. Even Tyler, his best friend, looked stunned. Someone muttered under their breath, "What the hell?" But Marcus didn't care. He closed his eyes and kept playing. And then, he took it a step further. He launched into an improvised solo, a complex flurry of notes, a jazz riff his grandfather had once told him took years to perfect. His fingers moved faster, dancing over the keys like they had a mind of their own. The music swelled, rising and falling, rolling through the room like waves. Miss Thornton was no longer crossing her arms. Now, she just stood there, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Marcus felt the shift in the room. No more waiting for failure. No more quiet mockery. Only one thing remained, respect. He finished with a strong, resonant chord, the deep sound lingering in the air, leaving a silence more profound than before. No one laughed. No one spoke. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys and sat still, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, a single clap. Then another. And another. Until the entire room was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. Brandon, the guy who had smirked at him earlier, sat with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. He actually did it. Someone whispered. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the sound of the applause wash over him. He didn't need Miss Thornton's approval. He didn't need anyone's praise. He had played. And they had listened. He stood up, turning to face Miss Thornton. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed together. Then she said, in a voice that was surprisingly dry, "That was unexpected." Marcus simply nodded. "I know." A beat of silence passed. Then she turned away. "All right, take your seat. We have a lesson to begin." But it didn't matter. Because now, Marcus knew. And so did the rest of the class. Everything had changed. Marcus was invisible no longer. And Miss Thornton would never be able to ignore him again. Marcus Bennett could still feel the warmth of the piano keys on his fingertips as he stood up from the bench. His heartbeat slowed, not out of fear or nervousness, but because he knew that something had just changed. He glanced around the classroom. Some of his classmates still looked stunned, as if they had just witnessed something unreal. Others nodded quietly, their eyes gleaming with an emotion Marcus had never seen before: respect. Tyler stared at him, mouth slightly open, before breaking into a proud grin. Even Madison Green, who was usually indifferent toward him, sat with her arms crossed, clearly trying to mask the admiration in her eyes. But the person who intrigued Marcus the most was Miss Thornton. She remained at the front of the room, arms crossed, but something was different. The usual confidence, the quiet authority she carried, was shaken. She was silent, her eyes slightly narrowed, as if struggling to process what had just happened. No more anticipation of failure. No more quiet dismissal. Just a long pause, stretched out with an awkwardness she couldn't completely hide. And then, as the applause died down, she finally spoke. "Well, that was unexpected." Her voice wasn't too loud or too soft, but there was something off about it. Marcus met her gaze directly. He didn't smirk. He didn't challenge her. He just waited to see what she would say next. The entire class held their breath. They weren't used to seeing Miss Thornton caught off guard like this. She licked her lips and crossed her arms tighter, as if grounding herself. "Where did you learn to play?" Her voice no longer carried the condescension it once did. Now, it held something different: skepticism, maybe even discomfort. Marcus didn't blink. "My grandfather taught me." A flicker of emotion crossed her face: surprise? Understanding? But whatever it was, it disappeared too quickly for him to catch. She nodded, took a deep breath, and turned toward her desk. "All right," she said, her tone firm again. "Take your seat. We have a lesson to finish." Marcus hesitated for a moment. The entire class was still watching. Something felt off. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone could feel it. She was trying to brush this moment aside, as if it didn't matter. As if the moment that had shattered all her assumptions wasn't worth acknowledging. Then, Brandon, the same classmate who had laughed at Marcus before, cleared his throat. "That's it?" Miss Thornton turned, her gaze sharp. "Excuse me?" Brandon shrugged. "I mean, he just played like something out of a movie." "And you're just moving on?" A few other students nodded in agreement. Tyler let out a quiet chuckle. "Can't handle it, huh?" Miss Thornton's grip on her lesson plan tightened before she flipped a page decisively. "This is a classroom, not a talent show," she said, her voice clipped, but no longer carrying the same authority. Marcus studied her carefully. He didn't move toward his seat yet. Then, he spoke. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" The class stilled. Miss Thornton's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. "I simply wanted you to share your talent with the class." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "No, that's not it." A faint shift in her posture. A hesitation. He pushed forward. "You didn't think I could play. That's why you asked me to do it." A murmur rippled through the students. Some exchanged knowing glances. Miss Thornton took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. That's just your assumption, Marcus. Marcus shook his head. Have you ever asked Tyler to play? Or Madison? Or Brandon? Silence. Miss Thornton pressed her lips together. That's irrelevant. Marcus didn't back down. For the first time all year, she wasn't the one in control. He could see it in the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her desk. The way her eyes flickered toward the students who were no longer just listening, but questioning. Something had shifted. And Miss Thornton knew it. She exhaled through her nose, steadying herself. Marcus, she said, her voice lower now, carrying a warning. Sit down. A beat of silence. Then, finally, Marcus nodded. He wasn't looking for a fight. He had already said enough. He walked back to his seat slowly, aware of the gazes still fixed on him. As he sat down, Tyler tapped his arm lightly, a silent acknowledgement. Marcus didn't need to say anything else. He didn't need Miss Thornton's approval. He didn't need her to admit she was wrong. Because everyone in that room had seen the truth. And the truth could no longer be ignored. Marcus Bennett didn't expect an immediate change. He knew the world didn't work that way, especially not for people like him. But he also couldn't deny that after that piano performance, things were no longer the same. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted. Miss Thornton continued teaching as if nothing had happened. She still called on the students she favored, still ignored Marcus during discussions, still carried herself with the same strict and authoritative presence. But there was one thing she couldn't hide: the way the classroom looked at her had changed. Marcus could sense it in the exchanged glances between his classmates. They had witnessed something they weren't supposed to, a moment where a teacher, known for being strict but fair, had unintentionally exposed her own bias. And they wouldn't forget it. When the final bell rang, the classroom filled with the usual sounds: chatter, scraping chairs, books slamming shut. But there was one noticeable difference: people no longer overlooked Marcus. Tyler was the first to speak. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder as they walked out. You just did something incredible, man. Marcus shrugged. I just played the piano. Tyler chuckled. No, you didn't just play the piano. You made the whole class go silent. You made her speechless. Do you even realize what you just did? Marcus didn't answer right away. But he knew. He had shattered something invisible yet heavier than any wall: prejudice. For an entire year, Miss Thornton had acted as if Marcus wasn't worth acknowledging. He wasn't the kind of student she expected to excel, wasn't the type she thought had any noteworthy talent. But now, everyone knew he could no longer be ignored. During lunch, as Marcus grabbed his tray and searched for a seat, he noticed something strange. People were looking at him, not with ridicule, not with amusement, but with curiosity. Madison Green, who had barely acknowledged his existence before, pulled out a chair across from him. When did you learn to play like that? She asked, her voice lacking its usual distance. Marcus shrugged. Since I was 5. She blinked, as if she hadn't expected such a simple answer. Seriously? I had no idea you could play like that. Marcus met her gaze. No one ever asked. Madison opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped, realizing he was right. Brandon, the guy who had once laughed at him, walked past his table. He didn't say much, just paused for a moment, then gave a small nod. You're good. Marcus hadn't expected praise from Brandon. But it wasn't just a compliment. It was recognition. Over the next few days, Marcus noticed a clear shift. His classmates, the ones who had barely spoken to him before, started to interact with him more. Not everyone suddenly became his best friend, but the difference was in their eyes: he was no longer invisible. They had heard him. They had seen him. And no matter how much Miss Thornton tried to ignore it, she couldn't erase the fact that he had left an impression no one would forget. That afternoon, as Marcus walked home, the golden light of the setting sun stretched across the familiar streets. He stopped by the small grocery store near his house to grab a bottle of water. As he stepped inside, old Mr. Henson, the shopkeeper, glanced up. The man smiled. "You look like someone who just did something important." Marcus paused, thinking for a moment. Then, he smiled back. "Maybe I just did." Mr. Henson nodded approvingly. "Good. Sometimes, all we need to do is show people what we're truly worth." Marcus took his water and stepped outside. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter. He didn't need Miss Thornton's praise. He didn't need her acknowledgement. Because now, everyone already knew who he was. Marcus Bennett didn't need praise from Miss Thornton. He didn't need her recognition, or anyone else's, to know his own worth. The most important thing he realized through it all was that true talent doesn't need permission to shine. He had nothing to prove to Miss Thornton. But by being himself, by letting his abilities speak for themselves, he made sure no one could ignore him anymore. 1. When someone underestimates you, let your actions speak. Miss Thornton didn't believe Marcus could play the piano. She expected him to fail, to stumble, to turn his performance into a joke. But instead of reacting with anger or frustration, Marcus chose the best possible response. He let his talent speak for itself. No arguments. No back-and-forth debates. Just a performance so genuine, so undeniable, that no one could dismiss it. 2. One moment can change how people see you forever. For an entire year, Marcus had been invisible to Miss Thornton and his classmates. But in just a few minutes, he turned that perception upside down. The lesson here is clear: sometimes, all it takes is one opportunity, one moment, and the right preparation to change the way the world sees you. 3. Bias exists, but you can break it. Miss Thornton never openly disrespected Marcus, but her bias had always been there, her unspoken judgment about who deserved recognition and who didn't. Marcus didn't fight her with words. He fought with music. And by the time the last note rang out, her perception had shifted. Some people, like Miss Thornton, will never admit they were wrong. They will pretend nothing has changed, just as she tried to do. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that the truth had been revealed, and everyone had seen it. 4. When you know your worth, no one can make you feel small. Class continued as usual after that day. Miss Thornton still lectured with the same authority, still tried to act as if nothing had happened. But Marcus knew the truth: she would never be able to look at him the same way again. He didn't need validation. He didn't need approval from those who once ignored him. Because he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer invisible. And more importantly, he had never been invisible. 5. Always be ready for your moment. Marcus had no idea that Miss Thornton would challenge him that day. But he had spent his whole life preparing for that moment. Opportunities to prove yourself don't always come when you expect them. But when they do, if you're ready, you won't just face them, you'll own them. As Marcus walked out of school that afternoon, he didn't need anyone to tell him he had done something important. Because some lessons don't need to be written in books. Some moments don't need official recognition, but still have the power to change everything. And the biggest lesson of all? When someone tries to diminish you, when they doubt your abilities, let your talent speak. Because in the end, they won't have a choice but to hear you.